Jesus was a hybrid. This is what people literally experience even today. They end up on a craft. Women will find themselves, without having any physical contact, which is exactly what Mary said, right? Pregnant one day. Often what usually happens is the baby is removed before it comes to full term. I know many people have been part of this hybridization campaign going back to the 80s and 90s. So when you look at Jesus, they have a human being that suddenly became pregnant. She gives birth to something that seems to have a transcendent understanding well beyond the average human. To many people, they go, that's a hybrid.
So the Bible would be shaped by these entities. Are those religious texts referring to God's source, or are they referring to these alien gods that created us?
The later Christian redactors, which basically means editors, skewed what was actually in the original language. This term Elohim, that's a plural term. It's more likely pointing to like a council of beings than it is one God. Numerous interdimensional God-like entities being on the scene. I do think you can both find threads pointing to like the one original source in the Bible, but you also get confused sometimes by the fact that there are other entities that are on the scene that are more powerful and more interdimensional than humans, but they're not the ultimate oneness or source consciousness, right? The original mind. This is why I think it demands we have a layered understanding of reality.
I'll just jump into it straight off because I think it's been something that's bothered me a lot. The seemingly lack of progression in terms of the subject and disclosure as a whole. And I have to be honest, because I don't follow it daily like you, and you're kind of immersed in the culture and have contacts, and I'm sure various places where you kind of get a different lens. You're looking through a different lens. But for myself, I found it kind of like they would roll out, whistleblowers, and then the government would say, it seems like a hype cycle and then it dies away, a hype cycle, then it dies away. How have you viewed the disclosure movement over the past couple of years?
Yeah, I think in some ways, the way you described it is pretty accurate. And I think the reason why it's difficult to track in a way is because everyone has a different felt sense of what disclosure would look like and when we've arrived at it, right? I do think that the broader purchase is happening. I think more people are talking about it than were a couple of years ago. But we haven't had the degree of confirmation maybe that some people were looking for to feel like we've passed that threshold. I think that's partly because it is complex, and so that there's always more to capture than there is bandwidth to be able to hold it. And so I think that's part of the reason why that's happening. I think just practically also you have the pull of defense contractors who are influencing Congress people to not support disclosure and not to support passing legislation that would help with disclosure, because they perhaps have things they want to cover up, or they have things that they feel like wouldn't be in their best interest as a company to have exposed. So it's tricky. And I think that very recently, I'd say the most important update is that there have been 3 attempts now across 3 different years to get some form of disclosure legislation passed as part of this large package that Congress endorses every year that basically funds the military. And 3 times it's failed. So 3 times it's been introduced and it gets dropped before the final legislation is adopted. And so I think many of the people behind the scenes, some of them being former government employees who have a lot of top secret information, who've been working to make this happen through conventional means, through congressional legislation and things, have themselves recognized that we need a different approach, that has failed, basically. There's too much dissension, there's too much conflict of interest within Congress and people being funded by some of the same defense contractors who perhaps want to keep this secret. So at this point, I think it is fair to say there hasn't been as much movement as people were hoping for. There have been 3 different hearings held in Congress now, which on the one hand is great and historically unusual. But we're still not that much further along in terms of this being recognized in the mainstream.
When you say defense contractors are holding it up, and I think a lot of people would go like, it wouldn't be a surprise if that was happening. Who in these organizations, could you look to a website and see the names of the people on there who kind of run it, or the board or whatever else, and go, okay, these people are kind of throwing a wrench in the plans and not letting it out? Or are these people behind the scenes that we don't know about who are controlling things that we never see in the public eye or hear discussed whatsoever? Is it that clandestine?
Well, I would say the way that we know that they are influencing things is we look at a particular congressperson and we see who their greatest funders are of their campaigns. And we see these large defense contractors showing up as major funders of their campaign. And then it's not a coincidence that those same people are the only Congress people that are basically saying we shouldn't pass this. So it's highly suspicious when you look at that. Now, I think it's complicated. I think we have to be careful not to assume that because they're shooting it down, that we know, for instance, that they absolutely have UFOs that they've been working to reverse engineer. I think you could draw that conclusion that they might have something that might be interesting. They themselves might not have been fully told what they were actually working on. This speaks to the layers of obfuscation, right? And I think that it gets complex, but when we look at the testimony of whistleblowers that you spoke about at the beginning there, one of the things that has consistently come up is that there have been crash retrievals across history. And this has happened in numerous countries, absolutely. And basically that ever since then, these defense contractors have been working to reverse engineer this technology. Some people have argued that even technology that went into the stealth fighters might have been arising out of some of those technologies that were discovered. At the same time, it's hard to know for sure. And furthermore, people who are skeptical will say, well, if we have this cutting edge, for instance, anti-gravitic technology, why don't we see it being used in a theater of war? Why are we still seeing conventional propulsion aircraft? That's a good question, and it raises further questions about, were there breakthroughs that were made in the middle part of the 20th century around anti-gravitic technology and things like that? Kind of a post-oil kind of economy, even to the degree to which some aspects of the military broke off and became kind of a rogue element on its own. And are they completely outside congressional or democratic oversight altogether? So there are really some deep questions, but undoubtedly some of these defense contractors are deep in the weeds with this topic, going back probably decades.
Yeah, because I've heard it a couple more times. I think with that documentary that's coming out, everybody keeps saying it's going to be almost like a disclosure movement in itself, and it has a lot of different sources. And I think I don't know if is it Netflix that they're...
Oh, you mean the new one, Age of Disclosure?
Yeah. Have you seen that?
It hasn't come out yet. It comes out on Amazon Prime
Amazon Prime, that was
in
it.
2 weeks. Yeah, in a couple of weeks it comes out.
But I think surrounding that, I think it was a clip that somebody was talking about, is that they're talking again about the death threats and the insinuation that people have been actually killed to withhold this information from getting out. Do you have any credible sources? Because a lot of this stuff is, it's not a surprise if it were to happen. If they did have this technology, obviously they would go to great lengths to stop it. But some of the criticisms is that some of these things are said, but there's no evidence. That's it's kind of a circular argument, because why would they let out evidence? You go around and around and around.
Right.
But is there any evidence that you have seen or spoken to anybody that would make you believe that is true?
Yeah, I would say that, for instance, I'm aware of people who are friends of mine who have personal friendships with some of these whistleblowers, where absolutely there were intimidation tactics used, things like someone going outside to their truck and finding a bullet standing upright on their dashboard. So someone's got into their truck and put a bullet on the dashboard. Pretty obvious what that's kind of insinuating. And we definitely can see times in history where you can draw a parallel, where someone was outspoken about the UFO topic and then suddenly had their careers crushed. We saw character assassination come in. This was much easier to do by a clandestine aspect of the military back then, without people knowing that it was going on, because we didn't have the internet and AI and stuff like that. But we definitely see a conspicuous decline of people in the public sphere who were daring to talk about this outwardly. And we certainly have cases, including one that happened earlier this year, where a scientist who was speaking openly about topics that are related to this area and to do with basically cutting edge technology, which would change the world if people were honest about it. Soon afterwards, we have a similar situation that's pretty familiar, where she apparently committed suicide. Now, this is often what happens in these situations, is people who don't seem suicidal, and when you ask their friends and loved ones, they would say they were not suicidal. But the situation is ambiguous, and there's nothing to lead authorities to believe that it's not suicide. But of course, the military also has this long history of perfecting assassinations and making them look like suicide. So I don't have direct firsthand evidence, but at the same time, I have no doubt that it's happened. And I think that when you really double down on holding this secret, and the longer you hold it over decades and decades, you have to do more and more to try and keep it secret. But at the same time, I think that lid is slowly coming off at this point because we live in a different era.
Are these what you talk about when you talk about like breakaway cells, kind of not under any kind of oversight? I mean, what branch of the military are you talking about? Just professional hitmen? Like I know this, we're getting into like rumor and speculation, but I mean, that's totally fine. That's what some of these conversations inevitably get into.
Right.
Have you had any ideas or thoughts about that, or been given information about that?
Well, there's a few things I would say. First of all, just yesterday or the day before, Eric Davis, who I know personally, who's a scientist who's worked at a really high level on these projects, he's spoken to me and to other people and on various podcasts about knowing that this is real, having seen things directly himself, including alien bodies and that kind of thing. And he basically said out loud in this podcast recently, if President Trump wants to give him a wide waiver in law that says that he's excused from his NDAs, he would absolutely testify before Congress to what he's seen. But without having that basically approval at that kind of level, he doesn't feel like he's protected legally. So that's the first thing to recognize here, is that these people understand that when they sign these NDAs, and of course the irony is that you signed the NDA before you find out the information, right? You only know what it is after you sign the NDA.
Yeah.
Then at that point, you're basically, in the worst case scenario, could be executed for treason, basically, if you disclose this information. So that's always over your head.
Uh-huh.
And on top of that, people do know that people have been in a more silent, stealthy way taken out, and even family members being oppressed and things like that. So in terms of who's doing it, I think it's a wide range of things. We had situations, for instance, that's more like psychological terrorism, where David Grush spoke about, for instance, he had dealt with, as many people coming back from war-torn regions have dealt with, PTSD and had some mental health challenges. This is very common. But in order to try to discredit him, some element of the military sent his, what should have been confidential health history, to let's say, a journalist with not the highest standards, who then published an article about him. And basically, it's clear the military was trying to discredit him, because when they can't discredit the information, they have to try to discredit the messenger. So there's been everything from that kind of psychological terrorism aspect, also where people talk about, it's very clear that if you speak up about this, you will never get promoted again. We will take away your clearances. If you don't have your clearances, you can't get another job. So there's that kind of aspect of the psychological terrorism and control. And there's other aspects, like I say, where people have literally disappeared or made to look like they committed suicide. And I think that is happening. Everything from the Air Force, I think, might be responsible for some of that. And some of this might indeed be some sort of tangential connection to some sort of breakaway group that might be operating outside of oversight altogether.
Off the top of your head, do you roughly, at least contemporary talking today, because I know it's hard to go back and kind of, you can't dissect every case and every person, but since you're so involved in this, in the culture, how many people have kind of gone missing, or, like a ballpark? Are we talking like counting single digits, or are we talking like significantly more than that?
That's a good question, and I wouldn't really have a clear number on that. I would say that the number of people who've actually been assassinated, probably not that high. I think that most of the time, 99% of the time, the psychological terrorism and the threat that you might have that happen to you if you speak out has been sufficient. And I think one of the things that's tipping now is that there are just too many people and too many different sources that are beginning to speak up about this. And on top of that, it's much easier now for someone on the outside to track these things and see when there is obfuscation and control being exercised by elements of the military. So I would say that historically, most of the control was exercised by stigmatizing this topic, by creating scoff around it. But when necessary, sometimes violence has been used as well.
Have you ever been, not harassed, but contacted by government? I mean, how far does that reach? Do they just focus on the people who are very high level and kind of spilling the beans on things, or will they trickle down even to you, someone who's covering it, actively involved? I would say a proponent of disclosure and getting that message out. Have you ever had interactions with any kind of government agencies or people working on behalf of them?
I would say that I have been told by people that I'm connected to who operate it at a pretty high level that I'm on the radar of some of these groups that are tracking these things. So they're aware of me and my activities, but I've never felt a personal threat myself. I've never had someone reach out and say, you need to stop talking about this or anything like that. And I think that's partly because in my case, I'm more interested in the big picture of what this means for the nature of reality. I'm not trying to expose names of people and things like that or specific programs. Some people, that's their focus. That hasn't been my focus. In fact, I'm more interested in what the implications of this all are.
Do you do that intentionally because you don't want to have those kind of interactions? Or have you made a conscious effort to I know because we talked about it last time, all the implications and how fascinating that all those rabbit holes are. So yes, obviously you probably really enjoy that. But secondly, do you stay away from the other because you don't want to have that in your personal life?
No, it's really because I find that the most interesting aspects are the implications. And I think that, it will come out when it comes out in terms of names and dates and programs. And I know some people are heavily focused on trying to get really tangible evidence so that we'll get this broad acceptance across our society. I don't personally feel that that's my particular job. My sense is that will happen when that happens. And until then, there's still plenty of circumstantial evidence and anecdotal evidence from massive numbers of witnesses over time to tell me that this is real and is much more consequential than we realize, actually, and speaks to all of our history and everything. So for me, it's really about where I focused my intentions has been around what I find most interesting, not because I've been worried about a certain topic or what might happen to me if I were to focus more on that.
Who's the number one senator or congressperson who is blocking this, and who is their funder?
I don't remember the fellow's name, and it's been a couple different people on different occasions who've been a stick in the mud. Yeah, but if you were to look it up, you'd find that they operate in a district that is the same place as where a defense contractor is located.
Do you remember what company that was? Or what aerospace company?
Well, Lockheed is one of them. Raytheon is another one. A lot of the big names that you've heard in terms of the defense industry are involved in this, because if you think about it, the number of major contractors who are doled out these different contracts, it's a pretty small list of the main companies. Because they have to have significant funding to be able to bid on these projects to begin with. So it's the usual players and some of the major defense contractors that are involved here.
And I watched I forget how long ago it was now, but it was Diana Pasulka, and I think she was on the Sean Ryan podcast. And she was making a couple references, and one of the parts of it we'll get into in a second, but she made a statement that the whistleblowers we see on TV aren't the real whistleblowers, and there's a whole host of people who are too afraid to come out, are trying to do things like really behind closed doors because they're so concerned about their safety. And she has interacted with maybe a couple of them in the past, and what they know would blow everything out of the water in terms of what we've heard so far. Have you heard anything about that, and what do you make of that statement?
Yeah, I absolutely think that there's many more, first of all, whistleblowers behind the scenes that have not come forward than there are that have come forward. I know that there's a whole host of people that have been waiting to watch how it's gone for those who have come forward. And frankly, what we've seen is that while Congress will wax philosophic about putting into law some protections for them, it's all been talk so far. And as I just referenced a while ago, even these disclosure aspects of legislation that have not been accepted and have not been adopted into law, because that has not happened, these whistleblowers behind the scenes do not feel protected. In fact, furthermore, what's even more concerning is that some aspects of the government, for instance, AARO, which stood up as an agency to basically investigate this. So they were tasked by Congress with looking into this, investigating it, interviewing whistleblowers so that we could find the truth, supposedly. But what many of those whistleblowers have said is that it looks more like AARO is acting like the gatekeepers themselves tidying up their own mess. So in other words, they have interviewed these whistleblowers, but many times the whistleblowers have sensed afterwards that this is actually another aspect of the gatekeeping, trying to establish where the leaks have happened so they can plug those leaks, and that they have no intention of ever actually helping this move towards disclosure. So this is part of the problem, is like, how widespread is the cover-up? And when you task the DoD or the Pentagon with investigating itself, how much in good faith is it going to do that? So we really need a truly independent body to look into this, and we're only going to get that when we have both Congress and the executive branch basically endorsing that. And so far we just haven't had that. And so I think absolutely there are people with civilization shattering information that are whistleblowers, but they will not come forward until they see a major move in terms of legislation and protections, which we just have not seen yet.
Have you heard any hints about what exactly they do know? I mean, are they just confirmations of what people already believe, or are these new ideas that we haven't even really thought of yet? Or does it all kind of go back to interdimensional beings who've been here the whole time, kind of have a great deal of control over us if they want to? I mean, where do you see that, I guess, the big reveal that hasn't been let out yet?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think part of the reason why that's complicated is that even the people with deep access have a very narrow access, right? So part of the way this has worked is that you have a need to know, and you only get to know what fits that very precise parameter. So this is partly what is also allowed the cover-up to continue, is that people will know certain things, and they can certainly surmise about what that implies about what they're involved in. They never know for sure. And so there's that aspect. And then I think also there's a very, very, very small number of people who fully understand what's going on here. We're talking about when David Grush came forward and talked about, for instance, the idea that there have been accords signed with some of these non-human intelligences. So literally, he has claimed that there have been high-level discussions with some of these intelligences, and agreements come to basically exchange of technology, for instance, so that the U.S. government will look the other way while abductions happen and that kind of thing. That this was the most consequential stuff. It's not just that aliens are real and they might be here, but it's that this goes back to our beginnings, perhaps, and that they might have been involved in human civilization and may have even orchestrated agreements and accords that have allowed them to act in stealthy ways basically the entire time. So on top of that, I think what's tricky about this is that people will, again, as people do, they will try to come to their own conclusions, but they will have their own biases as well, right? So if someone's a Catholic, and as like James Lukatsky, who has had deep access to, then he's going to try to see it from that worldview. Even Diana Pasolka, who you mentioned, is a Catholic, and she's a believing Catholic. That's going to shape how she sees this. This also is why the whole angels and demons things comes in as well.
Yeah.
You have the raw data, and you have the experiences, and you have the phenomena, but how you interpret that is still somewhat up in the air, and it's going to be influenced by your background. So the numbers of people who really have the biggest picture understanding, I don't know that they actually are people within the military at all. I think it's people who step back and look from the most overarching perspective. But I think something like accords being made between non-human intelligences and elements of the military is some of the most consequential stuff to come forward.
The angels and demons thing? Oh, what do you make of that? I mean, is it just the bias at play? Do they have reason to believe that it's, a source, at least on the malicious level? So then they, obviously it goes to demons and it's a supernatural thing. And what do you make of that? And then do you think that you also, have you had to kind of look at yourself and go, okay, well, am I bringing my own bias here? And then if that's the case, then how do we know at all kind of what we're dealing with, or is it just we don't?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we all need to be ongoingly checking for our own biases and our preferences. I think that you pointed to one of the challenges I see happening is that you have Congress people and politicians weighing in and being a little bit sloppy about when are they speaking from direct knowledge of something based on information and intel versus when are they just also including their interpretation of what they've seen, right? And so I think that I'm hesitant to take seriously what someone like Luna would say, who has her own religious background and may not be checking herself for her own biases. she'll say things like, the Book of Enoch was removed from the Bible in a certain century, and this might be pointing to what the beings are. That's much more conspiratorial than it actually is historically. So with my religious studies background, I understand why certain books were included and not in the canon. And I do not think it's as simple as the church knew that these beings were real, and to hide that truth, they just removed the book from the Bible. It's not that simple. That's part of the problem. Is you got people who have a religious interest and are religious adherents themselves, but don't necessarily understand the history enough to be speaking authoritatively, but they doesn't stop them from doing it. So that's part of the problem. I think too that one of the big issues here is that there's a wide range of behavior, everything from really beatific, transcendent experiences that are very similar to NDEs, where people feel like they are encountering angelic kind of beings, which is to say beings of light that are loving and seem to want to help people and will sometimes heal people. There's often a sense of being close to some sort of source presence or almost like God. There's everything from that to stuff that does feel kind of tormenting and that it's out to basically dehumanize us and doesn't seem, at the very least, doesn't seem concerned with human pain. So that full range is in play here and everything in between. And so the challenge is that people might have a preference for assuming this is demonic, for instance, and they'll only hone in on those negative ones, right? Or people who want to believe it's all love and light, like Stephen Greer, might hone in on just the really beatific experiences. And to make sense of this, we have to look at all of it. And I've definitely, over time, had to shift my perspective when I recognized that there's a broader swath of experiences than I originally recognized. The other thing I'd say, too, is that what makes this complicated is that when people say, is this just angels and demons, they are missing the fact that all that is a term to describe a being and an experience that people that are also human had in the deep past, right? So, in other words, all we're doing is exchanging our interaction with some sort of being that seems otherworldly and perhaps other dimensional, and we're just taking our experience, and rather than trusting our own ability to make sense of it, we're looking to ancient people's understanding of how they tried to make sense of it. But that doesn't really help us get any closer to what it ultimately is. We're just attaching labels that other people have attached. And the challenge is when you make it about angels and demons, not to say that some of that isn't true. I think that there are some aspects that also overlap with religious history. It's all part of the same thing. But the challenge is in religious history, you have all this dogma that was also added. And we have to be careful to parse out which parts feel phenomenologically real, in other words, part of the actual experience, versus the dogma that was added later on. So I find that it's not helpful to use those terms. We are dealing with beings that do seem to be the same beings that were represented in ancient religious history and have been part of the more recent UFO phenomenon. It's part of the same thing, I think, and people like Jacques Vallée have pointed to that. But we have to be careful to not quickly attach to terms, because that, I think, limits the possibility space, whereas in this point, we should really be open to everything and be taking data and try to make sense of it over time.
I think I saw Posoka as part of her statement there was that the reason she felt it was, or believed it was increasingly demonic or evil, was that the people she had access to and were talking to, I guess these whistleblowers behind the scenes, had that view. And what do you make of that? Because like you said, we're all coming at it from a different lens, but I think we can step back, strip away the terminology and go, okay, is this good or bad based on human perspective of what we would typically want out of something? I think we may have referenced that last time, and I had this conversation with my kids the other night. I was showing a picture of a lion trying to get out of a ravine, and crocodiles and things were trying to get it, and I think the crocodiles ended up getting it. And they were just like kind of like horrified, and I was like, well, from the crocodile's point of view, it's just eating. Like it needs to eat or it's going to die. So from the lion's point of view, that's evil. From the crocodile, it's not. And it was a weird conversation, obviously, with my kids to have to try to like get inside the other person or the other entity and kind of view it from their lens. But from our perspective, obviously, we don't want to be abducted. We don't want to be, all these other things that, that aren't maybe the beautiful parts. So what do you make of her saying that these people see it as bad because of the things they're seeing? And how do you kind of gel that with your experience and everybody else that you talk to?
Yeah, well, I think that as I say, there's a full gamut of experience happening. And I think this is one of the reasons why disclosure is difficult, because we tend to want something we can slot into our existing worldview, right? We want something that will somehow filter into what we already believe, because we prefer to believe that we have most of reality mapped. I think the challenge with this phenomenon is that it points to the fact that perhaps we don't, perhaps we're not even close, and perhaps we've been making sense of a reality scape that is just one dimension of a multi-dimensional kind of reality scape. And that human beings are somewhere in the middle of the food chain. You spoke about lions and alligators. We're somewhere on the middle of the food chain. And some people are just not prepared to have to accept that, because there's certain of our own behaviors we excuse when we're assuming we're at the top of the food chain. And when suddenly you're not, it makes you wonder about this. And I think also that there has been this group within the US government known as the Collins Elite, that is a group of basically, originally they were evangelical Christians, so pretty conservative theology, who a combination of what they saw happening and their understanding of what negative things exist out there. In other words, the things they were taught in Sunday school when they were kids, that those two things together led them to a conclusion that this is demonic. Now, on the one hand, I absolutely think that there are some negative things happening, and that's part of this full range of experience. And there are some people within those groups who would say that there were certain occultic practices that were engaged in the middle part of the 20th century that might have invited these beings in from some sort of other dimension, even from kind of a hell dimension kind of thing. Now, again, the question is, how much of that is just leaping to conclusions based on, your religious upbringing and what you're seeing, versus how much is it really well supported? No one's interviewing these beings and having them say, shoot, you got us. Yeah, we're demons. We came from hell. We'll sign the, disclosure agreement right now. Like, they're not saying that, right? So these are people having to leap to some degree to conclusions. But I do think your point is well made, that we can at the very least say, do these seem pro-human or not? Do they seem to be concerned about human suffering or not? Are there times where they seem, some of the beings, to be deceptive? They say one thing and then do another. All those things are true. Now, again, the challenge is, because human beings are often wired to notice threats more than something that's hopeful and positive, many people will hear what I'm saying and go, uh-oh, we're in trouble. If these beings somehow supersede us and transcend us and have it out for us, then we're in real trouble. I think this is part of a journey I've been on since we last spoke a couple of years ago, is understanding that even who we are as beings, my view of that has expanded, and we have to see ourselves as multidimensional beings as well. So in other words, this human experience, you might have heard this saying, we're spiritual beings having a temporary human experience. I think that's very true. And so this is where it gets complicated, because it's not just the nature of reality. It's not just the nature of these beings that, again, are everything from really benevolent to really malevolent and everything in between, but also that we ourselves are complicated and multidimensional. And you and I both know that it's very difficult to look at any particular person on average and say, are they a good person or are they a bad person? We're going to see some blend, right? And that's true for these beings too. But when it comes to the people within the government that are framing this in a religious perspective, I think a lot of that is their religious background helping to frame some of the malevolent actions they're seeing. But I don't think that they're getting any kind of information that would directly prove to them that they're right. I think they're leaping to a lot of conclusions, while at the same time recognizing that some of the behavior is apparently malevolent.
I spoke to a parapsychologist recently, Lloyd Arbach, and he was really interesting because he's had 40 years of experience, a lot of cases, and we got into the demon label, and it's funny, there's a lot of people who kind of grew up religious or are exposed to it young, and then as they get older, they kind of move away from it, or whether they had a bad experience or not. And he said at this point, he doesn't believe in hell, he doesn't believe in demons, and he said it's just made up, it has no use for science. It's very harsh to the idea. But he also admitted that there may be evil people in this life who then go to the next life and they're still causing problems and bad energy and all that kind of stuff. But he made it seem like most of the time it's just our perception of it is just wrong, and we think something's evil or it's not, or we have a bad, just all that different kind of things that just would unnerve someone if they're experiencing a haunting or something like that. Now, do you disagree with that? Even though you're denying the demon label and that kind of whole religious imagery, do you still feel like there is something that resembles that evil and that maliciousness that can do horrible things to people, from possessions to depressions to suicides to psychological effects. Is there entities out there that have that effect on people? And I mean, would you still describe that as kind of this alien interdimensional thing, or do you view these as separate entities, different species, different things?
I would say that my most overarching perspective that I have found very ably frames all of this and all of everything you just mentioned is to see that there's a range and a spectrum of consciousness development, and that the most ignorant beings tend to be the ones that most believe in the illusion of separation. So they're the beings that justify going to war and killing someone who wants the same deer that you're trying to kill. You kill your enemy, and they are your enemy because they're trying to take something you want. So the more that you see the world and reality is structured, and basically there's limited resources, and if I don't get it, somebody else does, and that justifies me killing them or wiping out a species or whatever. But I would say that's a rising out of ignorance, because I would say at the most fundamental level, everything is one, everything's connected. And this is also what the most benevolent of these beings will frequently say, is that you've, as a human race, lost touch with the fact that you are part of everything, and everything is a part of you, and that you've lost this sense of connection and the sacredness of reality, basically. But whether it's a human being or an alien, if they've largely lost track of that connection and they are acting as if separation is real, just like you pointed out with the alligators and the lions, right? Trying to explain to your child that one is not evil and one's not good. It's just that from their point of view, they're just trying to survive. And the more you believe that, it's a zero-sum game, and if I don't get it, you do, then you're going to justify basically killing or taking out that entity if you need to. So in that sense, what I've also seen, which is really fascinating, is that even when psychologists that are involved in what we might call, from a traditional perspective, oppressions and possessions, right? So within Christianity, for instance, as you know, exorcisms are a thing historically where basically people will get rid of a demon that's attached to a human being, basically. There are modern psychologists who are coming across, first of all, and this gets back to the point about us being more complex than we realize, that every human being has different parts that have been somewhat disassociated from the central self. And not always through trauma as well. Sometimes this just seems to be part of what we do to make sense of our world. And that you can identify and try to help integrate those parts of the self. But sometimes these same psychologists have come across what feels like an entity or an intelligence that is best treated like a persona, that has somehow energetically attached to that human being and is basically tormenting them in some way. But the difference is, and this goes to your point, they don't determine, therefore, that they're an evil being that must be cast out. Instead, they say, this is one of the beings that's living in ignorance and believes that it is a low being that doesn't deserve any better. And so basically, they will find this part that is what they call an unattached burden, right? So it's a being that's attached to them. It's non-corporeal, it's energetic, and they will actually encourage this being to go to the light. They'll say, can you look up and see light above you? Can you feel warmth? Can you reach out towards it? And then this entity that's been cruel and mean-spirited to this human being will say, at first they'll be quite resistant, then they'll be kind of harsh, and they'll swear at the person who's trying to tell them this. But eventually, they encourage them to reach out, trust that there is goodness out there, and that they themselves have been deceived. And eventually this being will reach out and move to the light. And the person is both liberated from this attachment, and this entity also basically gets to grow in their own movement towards oneness again, and trusting that they are actually ultimately good. So all this to say, I don't see this binary frame in reality of evil and good. I think that the greater the ignorance, the more likely entities can be influenced by low consciousness kind of vibrations, things like shame and guilt and hatred and rage, those kinds of things. But as you remember that you are part of source and part of everything, you are moving towards love and connection and harmony and things like that. So it's more about that on a interdimensional kind of level than it's about binary evil and good from my perspective.
So would you look at it, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so correct me if I'm wrong, is it on a cosmic scale, all these spiritual interdimensional beings, there's various groups of them or that exist, and that it's almost like human being behavior where you can war and fight depending on what level of kind of enlightenment, for lack of a better term, they're on. And some of the lower level ones who want to, just like, barbarians in the old times would ransack a village and rape and pillage. It's the same thing on an interdimensional scale. And so some maybe view human beings that way as like kind of weaker and they can attack us.
Absolutely. That's the way I look at it. And the same way that, we keep cattle and people can sometimes feel affection for their cattle, but they'll also slaughter them when it comes to that day. They use them for milk and things like that, right? I mean, I think there are some beings that look at us that way, right? Because we're not at the top of the food chain. But I think the most important revelation there is that one thing that happens across the board is that 99% of the time, probably even higher than that percentage, communication between the beings, regardless of which group it is and where they're from, and humans is always telepathic. In other words, that's saying that somehow, regardless of the morphology, regardless of the origin source, all intelligence seems to have this root understanding or this root commonality that you have to ask yourself, why would telepathy work across the board? I think it's because we fundamentally are all arising from the same oneness. And so that means that inevitably, what we find is, while there's kind of this sci-fi trope out there that would say that when we encounter an alien, we wouldn't even recognize it. It might be completely different than us. Undoubtedly, there will be some differences. But I think what's most fascinating about my encounters and my understanding of the lore across history is how similar to us aliens actually are. Because we're all on that process. We're all rediscovering, remembering that we're part of this original source intelligence, or in idealism, this is called like original mind. We're all fractals of that one original mind, whether it's an alien or a human. And so absolutely, I see this happening on a cosmic scale.
For evidence for this, how did you come to this conclusion? Is it through experience? I know we talked about last time your first kind of paranormal experience with a woman, I believe, in the hotel room, if I remember correctly. And then after that, you had experiences out with CE5 and then getting like telepathic downloads. Is this kind of, I guess, realization coupled with, your research and your studies over time, what led you to this belief? Or is there more tangible evidence that you could show like here to the public and go, this is the evidence I have of why I believe this is the way it works? And I know a lot of the stuff isn't that way, but I'm curious how you came to believe this is kind of the layout of the cosmos.
Well, I'd say that there are a convergence of reasons. That's probably why I called my podcast Point of Convergence. When I was, hitting a bit of a brick wall in studying ufology and trying to make sense of things, I decided I'm going to go start looking at other fields of inquiry in academia and see what they're learning about the cutting edge nature of reality. And I found some really interesting convergence, because within physics, for instance, there's this understanding that space-time cannot be foundational. This is basically, for the most cutting edge physicists, accepted as truth at this point. The math itself tells us that there must be a deeper structure below space-time. This is also what all the beings tell us, right? This is also what all the ancient non-dual wisdom traditions tell us, that this reality, as you and I experience right now, is largely illusory, right? So physics seems to be pointing to something very similar, that space-time is an epiphenomenon of some deeper structure that is not spatial or temporal at all. Then we have people like Donald Hoffman, neuroscientist, who is saying that he believes consciousness may be primary, and everything that seems physical is just an epiphenomenon of consciousness. And then you've got, even in astronomy, you've got this notion that we might be living in a hologram. We might be experiencing the 3D projection of a higher dimensional kind of frame. And so what gets interesting is when some people right away check out and go, you lost me at interdimensional. What does that even mean, right? But not only is like parallel dimensions and worlds described in quantum physics, for instance, but as I say, there's even this notion that we might be experiencing a holographic reality right now in astronomy. So whether it's neuroscience, astronomy, physics, I think the non-physical fundamental nature of our reality is pointing to something that might be called spiritual or consciousness-centric. And I think that whether it's consciousness studies or these other fields of inquiry, or the UFO phenomenon, or near-death experience, for instance, and what people report back from that, or if not sure if you're aware of this podcast called the Telepathy Tapes,
Yeah.
These basically nonverbal, highly autistic kids seem to be telepathic with each other. So I think all of this plays in.
How do you know, even with the positive experiences, because if certain beings are kind of outside space and time or have the ability to kind of traverse that plane of existence, their scale is not the same as ours. So how do you know they're not grooming you, for lack of a better term, in terms of showing you positive experiences and kind of that's what's been spoken about, in religious circles for a long time, is like the demonic entity will come to you, be your friend, do things that give you knowledge, give you gifts, and then slowly turn malevolent later. How do we know that's not on like a very long time scale? So it's kind of like, and this is things I've been told. So I'm having a lot of these conversations on the podcast. There is this conflict there to where they think at the end of it all, it's going to be malevolent, whereas experiencers might have a good experience doing something. Like CE5, I had a guest on who was really negative about that and said, you're opening the door to something you don't know what it is. So how would you respond to that idea that their time isn't the same as our time scale, and that on a human level, we just don't know what the end game is?
Something that's arisen in my awareness over time, and definitely even since we last spoke, was that because every entity, whether you're human or gray alien or whatever, because we're all arising from the same oneness, we can actually, when we practice discernment, we can deeply trust our felt sense. And so there comes a point where you cultivate a certain kind of discernment where you will have this direct knowing about things in reality. This is also spoken about not just in Gnosticism as an aspect of Christianity, but in non-dual traditions, there's this understanding that if you and I are actually arising from source consciousness, then when we tap in at a deep enough level, we can know from direct awareness, basically. It's not conceptual. So that's the first thing I would say. Second thing I would say is like, this argument can kind of run in circles because, someone could say this about my mom, right? Your mom's just got this slow running plan, right? She's really out to deceive you. You just don't know yet, right? Because she's playing the long game, right? And you realize to some extent at some point, all of us have to go with our gut instinct. No, I kind of trust my mom, right? I think also what happens is there is, again, some religious dogma that comes in where in evangelical circles, specifically more conservative branches of Christianity, there has been this notion that anything that shows up that seems paranormal is likely to be evil. Like that's a basic assumption that's brought in. And so if anything looks potentially negative or even looks ambiguous, there's a tendency to paint with that broad brush. So I think it's a combination of, absolutely practice discernment. Don't assume, right? I do know a situation, for instance, where somebody was not practicing discernment. They started hearing from this entity that was non-physical, started giving them information about the lottery and various things and things they should invest in. And at first they did well. And the person then basically completely trusted this entity. And over time, this entity led them astray and they lost their family and they lost their friends. And I think that was deliberate attempt by this entity to lead that person astray over time. Those things do happen.
Jeez.
Again, on these other dimensions, there's as much differentiation in goodness and evil, which I would just say is like self-serving, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the highest level as there are here. And so just like when you go and meet someone, you wouldn't assume that they mean you well or assume they mean you ill, right? You get to know them and you get a felt sense and you what's the expression? Trust but verify, right? So go in with an open heart and the sense that we're all connected somehow, but notice and pay attention to the behavior, right? Which again, from a Christian biblical point of view, you will know them by their fruit, right? So I would say we should apply that across the board, whether it's a human being or something we would label as spiritual or interdimensional.
Do you have any stories from people to where they've explained to you, I guess, these situations like this was this lottery example where the voice was coming? Are there other examples to where the person was able to tell it to leave or to leave them alone and it would? Or are these things that basically decide when they come and go and there's not too much we can do about it on that level?
That's a great question. And I would say this comes back to what I said before about we are more complex than we realize. It really comes down to how you understand yourself and to which degree of authority are you ascribing to yourself. So for instance, people will say, what do you make of the fact that when a negative entity is showing up and someone says, in the name of Jesus, get out of here, and they do, does that mean it actually was a demon and that Jesus was the one that has the ability to get rid of them? And then I'll point out that somebody else might, call out to a different kind of deity, right? Or in the name of all that is loving and good, I banish you, whatever. Um, or if it's just simply someone saying, my locus of attention is around love and light and connection, and you are not welcome here. Or even something like exuding love, right, towards this being, and it can't handle it, and it just takes off. You don't even have to say anything; you just emit love. So what I'm saying is part of what happens here is that these entities that are self-serving, so they're lower in the awareness, right? So they're more self-serving, furthest from source. They will try to dominate. And if you remember back in the Gulf War, there's this notion of shock and awe, right? I think some of these beings come in with shock and awe to try to make us feel small and limited and vulnerable, and then they take advantage of that perspective. And as long as we believe that about ourselves, then they can have that arrangement with us. But if we can actually tap in and find a higher resonance in ourselves, because all of this is very, very energetic, then not only can they not hang around, but they don't want to hang around because they find it very difficult to be around that positive, high energy.
Mhm.
So this is where it's really important. People shouldn't just take any entity, or whether it's a human or a gray or whatever, at face value. They may tell you things, right? We created you. You have no capacity to resist us. But as long as you believe that, then functionally that's true. But, the question is that true? And I would say that when we can call to a higher authority, and realize that we are connected to that higher authority, as are they, then you get this kind of superseding kind of ability to resist. So it's complex because it's not just about where we are in the food chain, but it's about how we resonate in our own understanding of how we're connected to source. And if we can get closer to that understanding of who we are, then we can repel these things. And so I do know absolutely people who have come up with strategies that basically allow them to repel the approaches of these different entities.
What would one of those be? Is it something that it's easy to do, or is it just, again, have to be based in their own beliefs and understandings and rituals that maybe run in the family, like, like invoking Jesus, holy water, or burning sage, or whatever it is? Or is it something on a psychic level, mentally? Because this other parapsychologist I talked to said some mediums who have that talent get bombarded with things trying to talk to them, and they have to learn how to shut it off. Is it similar?
I'd say both and, right? I would say that even like holy water or these different things that you might use, crucifix or whatever, all of that basically is just you ascribing a certain energy to that thing, right? Or to that process. So it's the psychic element, right? The whole point is that physical reality is illusory, right? Everything is energetic or spiritual ultimately. And so it's really about the level of energetic purity that you're able to bring into the situation, which you might have different paraphernalia you use and different words you use to describe that, different deities that you call upon. But basically, again, it's about raising your resonance to that level. And then these beings respond depending on that. And at other times, though, it is something as simple as recognizing that when you open the doors to some extent, you want to be purposeful about when you're doing it and when you're not doing it. And so I've actually coached some people who were making the mistake of they will like go into a prayerful kind of contemplative stance, and they'll be praying for people and various situations when you're kind of like you're opening yourself up into this broader interdimensional kind of landscape. But then if they don't, when they come back to themselves and their body, like close those doors, right? And again, there's no specific, you got to follow this particular procedure. I mean, energetically close those doors, then other things can drift in after, and they found this, right? So this speaks to something called spiritual hygiene or energetic hygiene. Just like we do certain things, and you wouldn't recommend your kids go walk around some part of the city at a certain time of night, and you do get your kids to brush their teeth. In the same way, when we're working in this multidimensional kind of landscape, you have to practice things, and spiritual hygiene is important to make sure that you can keep yourself safe, just like we do some of that in the real world in our waking experience.
I've heard the vibrations, the energy, some of the terminology you're using. I heard that before, and I think for some people they hear that and they kind of like roll their eyes and they think, "Oh, it's woo woo," kind of like crystal type, vibes. But on the other hand, I've heard it from other people, and I think it's. Can you describe what you mean by that? And I guess is it how you feel in terms of your emotional state, and then when you're putting out this, quote unquote energy, I take it that these beings can sense that. So if you could, I guess, crudely visualize, I guess, what that would be to kind of give, we're a lot, like you said before, it's like we're using terminology and we're trying to think about things that aren't in our own like survival mode of like just a human being. So it's like everything sounds kind of like just, how do I picture that? How would you describe that to people who kind of like either just don't buy it or are trying to visualize what that means when people use those terms?
I mean, the way I like to think about it is by parallels, right? So in the same way that we understand a notion of biological immunity, right? That if you have a healthy immune system, you are not able to be preyed upon by certain kind of bacteria or viruses and that kind of thing. Where someone with a weaker immune system will be very susceptible to those kind of viruses. We know this is true, right? Some people can walk into a market, they'll come away with a virus, somebody else won't because their immune system is stronger. I would say that this happens across the psychic realm in these interdimensional kind of spaces that interpenetrate each other. And so when you are someone who, for instance, has a lot of shame and guilt and self-hatred, self-loathing, I would not recommend that they go and practice CE5, for instance, because CE5 opens the door, right, to this entire landscape, not just a certain aspect of it. And just saying the words, yeah, something good, will you please come and say hello, doesn't really matter. What really matters is what you're energetically emitting. So if you, for instance, have a lot of self-hatred and fear, that's actually what's going to be emitting, and that's going to set a signal that will attract certain things. Just like you hear about some people seem to always end up with narcissists, and we're like, how does that keep happening, right? It's because of the energetic equation between the two kinds of people, and narcissists can smell blood, if you will, when there's someone they can prey upon. Same thing happens in this kind of energetic realm. Except it's even more psychically vibrant, and they can feel that fear, right?
Do you know people who've done the CE5 and had a bunch of negative stuff come to them because they're in that bad state? And does it manifest like a haunting? How does it kind of show up in their life?
Right. Well, I'd say the vast majority of CE5 experiences are positive because people generally are going with a good intention. They often do it with groups, and it's sort of like the group, center of gravity matters. But I do know some experiences that were not good. And I would say that in those cases, I'm aware that there's usually mitigating circumstances. Like, for instance, that person did have a lot of fear. They had kind of like a fractured psyche, right, that was involved in this. So it's important to point out that it's not about, some incantation or following a certain procedure manual, because what really matters is that you become self-aware about your own internal energy. And if you're actually radiating fear, then that's what's going to be actually going out into the field and become the medium by which something can interact with you rather than the words you're saying. So I think when we think about, as an example, to the skeptics you mentioned, recently I was reading about this. When this first doctor began to put together that when he washed his hands, people seemed to not get sick when he did surgery with them, right? And he started suggesting to other doctors, I think we should wash our hands. And they're like, this is ridiculous. Like, you're saying something, woo, we can't see, but magically if I wash my hands, right, it's going to help the person. Like, not only did that happen, but it took years before there was enough evidence to persuade that bias, right? But yes, it turns out there are these microscopic things that we can't see, and just by washing our hands, right? So someone might go, oh, there's something magical about washing your hands. And you're like, no, it's actually an energetic purification, right? And I'm saying the same thing happens in these realms as well. And fundamentally, because, and again, physics would point to this, astronomy to some degree is pointing to this, neuroscience is pointing to this with the hard problem of consciousness. None of this is as it appears. I would say it's all an energetic realm. And the more that we can learn to practice and be aware of our own energetic energy and not just the words we speak, then we begin to operate in a more holistic manner, in an effective manner in these interdimensional realms.
I've heard this from a couple people, and I want you to tell me if it's true, or if you have seen this or heard of this, is that some people who engage in these contact rituals or CE5, whatever it is, to try to reach out to these beings, that some of them are actually building altars in their own personal places and trying to like almost worship them. And maybe it's kind of the darker entities that come into contact. And I had one gentleman on, he used to describe himself as a demonologist, but now I think he's more into like research and trying to figure out what it is. And his view was, it's all, there's like consciousness, there's like that level of consciousness. And then whatever these malicious entities are, they're tapping into that and then trying to access us and kind of manipulate us in different ways. But one of his critiques was that some of these people are using altars and worshiping them, and that's what some of these entities seek. Have you seen that? Is that true, or is that just kind of like an urban myth?
I have not heard of that specifically, but I also wouldn't be surprised if it's happening. When you think about the occult in general, and I don't mean that as a negative slur, I just mean this notion of like there being kind of secret knowledge and practices you can follow that can invoke and connect with some of these other realms. I think that's real, and people will use different methodologies to try to embody their intention, right? But I think, again, the key is the energy behind the intention, not the actual practice itself. So I'll give you a quick example that's kind of a funny parallel again, because it's easier when people can see this in our history. So at one point when I identified more as a Christian, whereas now I'm sort of more non-dual, more like a Buddhist kind of thing. But I remember in my Christian circles, there was this thing where in this one church, there'd be like this laying on of hands, right? When you're trying to pray for somebody, right? But what would happen in this laying on the hands, you wouldn't actually touch the person. You get like about an inch from their skin, right? And so everybody thought this was some sort of like magical sacred thing, right? That you don't actually touch, you get like an inch away. Turns out that church began in Southern California, and it was just too hot when people kept touching everybody, right? Like it was just a pragmatic thing. Like, man, it's hot in here. Can you just like maybe get an inch away, right? But over time, people go, oh, there's something magic about the inch away thing, right? So same thing with setting up altars, right? Like if you think about it, it's just a procedure people are doing to embody an intention. And again, I think the key is not the specific entity you're invoking or the specific practice or whether or not the altar is painted a certain color or made of a certain kind of wood or not. It's all about the intention behind the practice.
Why do you think the occult gets such a bad rap? I know in obviously Christian circles, it's really frowned upon, obviously, and engaging in that is going to bring the dark entities to you. How do you feel about the occult? Why do you think it's so, I guess, dumped on? Is it just from the religious point of view? And is that integral to contacting these beings and entities? Do you kind of have to dabble in that?
Yeah, I would say that one of the most interesting aspects of the UFO phenomenon is the overlap with the occult, right? And anybody who looks into this, for instance, there's this guy named Jack Parsons back in the 20th century who was at the forefront of our U.S. rocket technology and was a brilliant scientist and pioneered some of our rocket technology. But he also had a massive interest in the occult and was, a follower of Aleister Crowley, right?
Oh, that's
and
right,
so
yeah.
when he wasn't, busy making rockets, he would be basically setting up occultic practices to connect to certain kind of beings, right? And there are even elements of that Collins elite religious conservative group that I talked about within government who blame Jack Parsons for inviting something in from kind of a hell realm that they think he actually was successful and that he caused the modern UFO phenomenon, but they see that all as a ruse and it's actually all demonic, right? So this is all connected. Now, I think within Christian circles, the reason why the occult gets a bad rap is because, again, there's a very binary notion. It's either from God and follows certain very specific kind of protocols, or if it's not that, it must be evil. So if you're doing anything, even if you think you're doing something to connect with something that's neutral or good, if it's not following a particular dogma, your only option is you're going to end up connecting demons and creating a bridge that you don't want to create. And so that's really where that comes from. I would say that in general, the occult is just a recognition of this multidimensional reality, and that what we perceive in our waking state is just one of quadrillions of configurations of consciousness. And I've explored some of those myself. And so you can attune our consciousness configuration and tap into different realities. So the same way that someone's on a psychedelic, for instance, they actually experience other kinds of beings, right? There's this really fascinating notion of machine elves that people encounter when they're on DMT, right? And people who have no history with each other, no connection, seem to encounter the same kinds of beings. So they seem to have some ontological reality beyond someone's imagination or something. And right now they're doing, these experiments in the UK where they're basically doing intravenous DMT, right? Introduction into the human body over days. So rather than going in for a few hours and coming out, like they're staying in that process.
It's wild.
And there seems to be a coherent reality that they're encountering, right? And coherent beings, right? And sometimes people have done DMT only once every 20 years and they encounter the same beings and are like, oh, you're back. We missed you, And that's another fascinating thing is that, a friend of mine, she went to Peru to do a traditional shamanic ceremony with a Peruvian shaman. She had no interest or history with UFOs and ended up, after taking ayahuasca, of which DMT is the main ingredient, the psychoactive ingredient, she found herself on board a UFO interacting with aliens who recognized her and who she somehow knew that she knew them in some other kind of identity or reality scape. So this is all connected, right? So whether it's psychedelics, whether it's like stimulation of certain parts of the brain. There's some suggestion by limiting the frequency of certain parts of the brain, we experience more of reality, not less. Or whether it's deep meditation practices that people can access these realms, or it's literally by occultic practices. These are all different ways of turning the dials of consciousness and experiencing different parts of reality.
Can these beings shapeshift and appear to you in different things? Because we talked about it last time, and some people seeing a gray, some people seeing a reptile, some people seeing a werewolf, and then we talked about how it's easily mocked. And was it intentional on behalf or on the intelligence part to appear to us in ways that we never can quite put a finger on and show evidence for because they don't want to be revealed in that way? Would you agree that they can shapeshift and move around like that? And would you put those in the malicious camp? Or because even we talk about angels in the Bible, and some of the old saints would describe them as actually kind of scary looking, and only like the beautiful wings and stuff kind of came, symbolism later and things. And with your religious background, what do you make of that and the different appearances over time? Because before it was like, they just put them in different categories. Oh, they're from this planet. These people are from this planet. And what do you think of all that?
Well, I'd say, first of all, absolutely, some can shapeshift for sure. And, but that's not necessarily a malevolent thing. For instance, there's this certain group that's encountered within the UFO phenomenon known as the blue men or the blue beings. So they look mostly humanoid, but they have a blue tinge to their skin. And they actually claim that their history is that they at one point were a terrestrial species just like us, and eventually evolved to the point where they were no longer had to have a corporeal grounding. They could basically exist just as consciousness. But that they are incredibly benevolent beings who actually go around and recognize that we're all connected. And therefore, if you recognize we're all connected, you want to help each other as brothers and sisters. So when they interact with human beings, for instance, they're perceived as very benevolent, very helpful. And they will say they will take on their form as being perceived as a blue humanoid being for our sake. So they'll do it because we get along better when we can see something and interact with it, rather than it just being some invisibility. But they don't have to take that form. Other times, I have friends of mine who, for instance, have parents who encountered what they thought was an angel in their bedroom one time. And when we pressed them, what did you actually see? Well, it was basically like a column of light that was semi-transparent that just appeared in front of the bed kind of thing, right? So that's another aspect of the UFO phenomenon, is these things known as light beings. They basically just appear like columns of light, kind of diffuse around the outside. And to your point, absolutely, there's a reason why angels often said, do not be afraid. And it's because people were freaked out of their minds because they looked like crazy looking and sometimes scary, right? And we've been evolutionarily shaped to be fearful of something that looks like, whether it's tentacles or something that just is moving and seems to have many different parts, and it freaks us out, right? At the same time, I want to be careful not to paint with too broad a brush, because some people will say, so that explains like these humanoid shapes, that they're not actually humanoid, they're just doing it to make us feel better. I don't think that's true either. I think that these Nordic-looking beings that look a lot like us, but specifically having Nordic traits, I think that literally is what they look like. And one of the conundrums we have to overcome here is if these are aliens, how come they so often look humanoid and human looking even sometimes? I think both those things are in play. There's definitely a humanoid aspect, which might mean that we actually are following a prototype that had been used elsewhere in terms of our human form. But they're absolutely beings, and the more they are moving towards that source level, where they are not only connected more to source in their understanding, but they're more powerful because they can wield energy in the same way that you might perceive a god can basically create realities and use consciousness to basically paint physical structures, including their own, the own way that they appear. So, and sometimes that will also be used by a negative entity that will deliberately appear, like a reptilian, for instance, because they know that's going to freak you out, and that will give them an upper hand from the get-go. So, absolutely happens, and it happens both for the malevolent and benevolent, depending on what their purpose is.
I think everybody wants an experience to see what's true. They want to know if angels exist, or demons exist, or these entities exist, or spiritual beings, consciousness, what comes after, do we survive death? All those questions, like we've talked about last time, is like burning questions for myself, but I'm almost too afraid to like see anything. Because if I see it, I'm going to freak out. I'm like, oh my God, am I going crazy? So it's this weird thing where I don't want to open the door. So I probably walk around like just psychically shut off like all the time because I just don't want to see it. So for the people, I mean, what do you make of all this? Like, one, should people be afraid? Two, when these things pop in like this, is it always interdimensional? Do you view that? Because we talked about kind of like the different races of the world, and this is kind of the interdimensional layout of that. Or can there be hauntings on top of that?
I would say it's complex, and it can be many different things. I think that you make a good point when you say that on the one hand, you want to see something, but part of you is aware that you'd be freaked out. And so that raises the question, are you shutting down the possibility preemptively, but maybe not even being aware of that you're doing that, right? And I think one of the reasons this gets really complex is that I would say that our consensus reality is a byproduct of what we all believe is true, right? So as that begins to change, and there's been some people like Whitley Strieber who've cautioned that when we fully, at a broad level, accept that these beings exist in these other dimensions and can interact with us, that just the acceptance of that on a broad scale changes the level of their interaction with us and might create more of a merging of dimensions. I think that there absolutely are beings, again, I don't look at so much as angels in the traditional sense of there's a good God on one side and a bad Satan on the other side in that binary view. I see it more like if there's a being like a Lucifer kind of being, they've fallen into ignorance, and they eventually need to be encouraged to come back to the light and recognize they're part of the oneness that we all are. I think that's true for anything we would call demonic as well. It just is really ignorant and operating under those low frequency kind of vibrations I talked about, hatred, fear, anxiety, all those kind of things. But I think what happens is, as you get closer and closer to source, which is to say you remember more and more that you are part of the oneness, and that your sphere of care and concern has gotten larger and larger, so you want to help other beings, you also are much more powerful, and you can basically, like I say, at that point, wield realities. You can work with reality itself, and you can look in any appearance you want to take. And so when those beings appear and they are here to inspire us and to call it our best intentions, they, for all intents and purposes, are like angels. It's just not falling under that strict dogma that you might come across in certain circles of Christianity.
I remember Pasolka said that she wouldn't want her kids to see an angel because often with that, there comes some kind of request or not necessarily a good outcome that you might do something on behalf of them, like a messenger, like it gives you I think she used St. Joan of Arc as an example, and then she ends up I think she was burned at the stake, right? After leading and winning battles. So I think there's a fear there in terms of what you open up to, even though, of course, I want to know what comes next. And I struggle with, and I feel like a lot of the worries would go away too. Like you worry about suffering, you worry about what kind of pain my kids are going to have to go through in their life. I worry about what kind of pain my family, you go down the list of stuff and you get caught up in like those concerns. And I feel like, as we've talked about Bernardo in the past and stuff, and having those, whether it's a DMT trip, an NDE, meditation, and getting a more macro perspective about what's important, and I think, and not worrying about what comes next. But I don't know. I think I've gone back and forth with like, not that I had like a trip to Peru planned, but but I don't know. Like, do you have any? How do you overcome that in yourself? I mean, have you noticed it through all this work that you've done and these sessions you've led and things, that your fear and worry and all that kind of stuff in day-to-day life has decreased a lot?
Absolutely. Like I've had experiences since we last spoke where I have basically left this construct altogether.
Like, God, tell me.
Yeah. So I have a specific protocol that I use, which I don't tell people the details of because it can be dangerous physically and psychologically if you do it incorrectly. But it basically happens over 2.5 days or so. You have to prepare and then you have to have a time to sort of debrief afterwards. But basically, I fully leave this construct. And I've done this 5 times now. The first time was Christmas of last year, and I've done it 5 times since then. And it's fully leaving, and you know that you've left, and you know when you come back. And when I come back, each time, the first thing that hits you like a slap to the face is this is not real the way we think it is. And it's not cerebral. It's not me surmising, going, I think when I put 2 and 2 together, it's not like that. Like when you've been outside and you come back, you know this is not real, right? So the same way that people have a near-death experience and they say that's more real than this, right? Same thing happens in the UFO phenomenon, which begs the question, is this all part of the same thing? I think it is. Some of these beings can traverse these different realms, even realms that we think of distinct between the living and the dead. That's one of the fascinating things. When a gray alien shows up with your Uncle Tony, who died 10 years ago, what's actually happening there? But absolutely, in those moments, I come back, I realize that number one, this is not real, that we don't die, right? That this is all illusion. It's purposeful illusion. It's meaningful. It's meant to give us the circumstances and the stage props by which we will learn to work with energy, of which everything is actually made out of, right? Including us. And so being aware of and beginning to tune in and become self-aware about like the fear that you're talking about is a big part of the journey. That it's an early understanding that if you are manifesting fear, you're going to attract that to you, that there is a certain way this works alchemically. And as you move towards higher vibration, which is to say things like unity, connection, peace, that kind of thing, then that also determines your alchemical structure and relationship with reality. So first thing I would say is that for me, I've always been a very positive, optimistic person. People have said to me, you're a little bit like Spock sometimes, like you seem remarkably like even keeled, right? Like I don't really ever experience anxiety. I've never dealt with depression, right? So I'm already operating in a bandwidth where I just have a basic trust in reality. Partly comes down to having loving parents and good things in my circumstances, having really good friends and relationships. But because of that, I go in with, I think, operating at a high vibration. And I know some people are like, that sounds like woo talk again, but I literally mean that you, in the same way that, your chemistry teacher in high school pour certain things into a test tube and weird things happen, the same thing happens energetically with the way that we entertain and engage in certain kinds of activities. Some are lower kind of vibration and some are higher vibration. It's all alchemical. So in those experiences, I have also been able to tap into the fact that I am a fragment of source, that we do, in fact, all arise from this oneness. And in that sense, we are all like the leaves of the tree, which is God, right? It's all part of the same thing. And so when you come back, absolutely. I remember the first thing I did was, I'm going to have a second lunch because it's not real anyway, right? Like you literally think that way for a second. I remember looking at my cat and going, you're an amazing hologram, but I know that you're not real the way I used to think you're real. Now, this is an important thing. I think a lot of people go, oh, so should you just skate through life because it's not real? And I'm like, no, like it's meant to feel real. It's meant to present the opportunity for you to grow spiritually. So you get the best of both worlds. You can really live into it without fear because you realize that even things like suffering and pain, when we think about our kids, I realize that, that's going to be very, very temporary and it'll be in service of this ongoing spiritual growth. And there's some aspect of them that they're kind of obfuscated from, chose to come in and chose you as a dad and chose me as a dad, right? Like this is part of their history. And this is one of the things, by the way, that I also point to when we're talking about how do you know these beings aren't, schooling you basically and just grooming you to like use you later. One of the most compelling bits of data is that when people have had very positive experiences with these beings, they will come back and they will ongoingly live differently. They will be less concerned about money. They won't care about material goods. They will want to help their brother and sister because they see everyone is connected now. They have no fear of death. So it fundamentally changes how they show up and live. And this happens with NDEs. It happens with benevolent contact experiences. And it's absolutely been my experience. And it has changed how I look at everything as well.
I got to ask you the details of it, and not to what you do to get into it, because I just, generally speaking, are you talking, is it under the umbrella of psychedelics to get you there, or are you talking meditation, or just kind of like ballpark?
It's multi-pronged. So there's like numerous things I do to really put it into a category where I leave the construct altogether. So, but I really don't want to give details because
don't do it. It's totally fine. But because Bernardo talked about, he said a lot of people will go just to like the tip of, when they take DMT, they'll just kind of go to like a certain layer. But he said if you take enough, you blast like way past that, and you start merging back with like the source. And he says it's a completely different experience, and that's where you kind of completely shed the ego. So are you getting to that point, or like what are you seeing? Because I know it's impossible to describe for a lot of people with NDEs and these kind of things, and you have to find earthly language for it, and it's really hard. But I'm really curious to speak to someone who's done it the multitude of times that you have. Is like, what exactly are you seeing, or can you give any symbolic sense to like what you're experiencing? Are there entities, the communication, like how you're coming back essentially changed in terms of not worrying about the day-to-day stuff that I am?
Yeah, well, I would say that I'm glad you framed it the way you did, because part of the curiosity and the difficulty in describing it is that it often transcends notions of space and time altogether. And so when I have to choose words that are embedded in space-time and arising from a notion of space-time, you're already going to be losing some of the sense of it in translation. So sometimes I would just know things by presence and identity rather than by seeing things, right? So it's a sense it gives you rather than seeing it. But there are also things you do see, but the way you see is completely different. So for instance, you see everything in all directions happening and all at once with incredible clarity. So when you and I are usually walking through the waking state, we're actually only seeing with focus wherever we're looking. And we don't notice because we're not looking there, but everything in the periphery vision is actually blurry, right? Because it's really only the high fidelities wherever we're looking. Well, in this experience, everything is super high fidelity in every direction all at once. And I remember seeing this was like a golden superstructure. So it's a vibrant, radiant, golden superstructure that has incredible detail, like almost like code or like hieroglyphic kind of code in it, down to incredible detail. Like it's super granular. So you're both taking in this massive object, and you can see in all directions at once. So it's all around you, and you can see incredible detail of things that are going on, and it's so intricate that you're like, where do I look? And then when you look in a certain place, it's like you zoom in because that's your intention, and you suddenly open up a whole reality scape that comes into being because that's where you focused. And sometimes you do come across entities there, or there are times where I've come across a collective consciousness, but it feels like a collective consciousness of which I'm a part in a different kind of manifestation, because you also fundamentally know, it's not a notion, you just know it directly via gnosis, that there is no time really, but all these things are happening simultaneously, right? Time is just one of the stage props that it shows up this way so that we can make sense of things in a certain way. So you even encounter different aspects of you in different realities that are happening at the same time. And there were other times where I experienced it more like waves, but the waves were like composed of pure emotion, and it's the most intense, unconditionally loving, but also extremely overwhelming kind of emotional energy, where everything when you come back feels very muted. Like even deep love here feels very muted compared to that. And when that's washing over you, you just like can hardly handle it. And it feels like it's going to kill you and cleanse you at the same moment. That's how intense it is. And I remember in my religious studies background, coming across people who'd had encounters with, spiritual beings, people who would see the upper torso of Jesus, for instance, and feel waves of unconditional love rolling off them to the point where they eventually had to say, "Can you please go away?" Because it's so intense that we can't contain it, right? Like that's how intense it is. And I definitely have had those experiences where it's positive and benevolent and incredibly loving, but so intense that I feel like it's gonna like explode my structure. And every time I have this experience of it's almost going to kill me. Again, because I'm a positive, optimistic person, I assume that that is largely illusion. It's not actually going to kill me, and I've come back every time so far. And then the last thing I'll say is that when I do come back, you get some weird after effects because everything happens simultaneously all at once there, and you can do many things at the same time, right? So you may have seen these depictions in like Hindu history, for instance, of these like blue beings who have multiple arms.
Yeah.
I came back one time and I had been used to being able to do multiple things all at once and explore all these different realities. And when I concretized back into this thing that known as Darren, I was trying to move about my day, and your notion of time is all messed up. You start something, you can't remember when you started it, when did you finish it, did you get halfway through, like did I leave the oven on? Like things get really weird because you've become configured to being outside of time. And I also did this thing where, because I'm used to being able to do things at once, I came back and I'm like, okay, I want to read a book and I want to drink some coffee. So what I proceeded to do was pour coffee in my eye, like literally.
God.
I went like this and like, and like coffee in the eye. Because literally my brain had to remember and translate back that here you have to do things one at a time. And that wasn't my experience there.
What's your view of religion right now? Because I know you said you're Christian background. I'm Catholic. How do you view it? And I mean, do you feel like there's some worth there still in terms of the lessons and the metaphors? And I think, like we talked about, it's just labeling how people in ancient cultures maybe understood it. Do you believe, I don't know, net positive, net negative, or do you feel like it's kind of hindering this whole disclosure movement and kind of the realization of consciousness, idealism? Do you still think it blocks that, or do you think it has a role to play?
I'm glad you asked that, because I think my answer would probably surprise some people, because I would say that looking back, I at first was in those Christian circles and did a religious studies degree, and then kind of went more secular and kind of let go of the spiritual understanding of reality. And then ironically, through personal experiences that were, transcendent, and because of what I studied and, researched in the UFO phenomenon, I have found now an understanding of reality that transcends and includes both of those, right? That's the key part, includes. So I see religion as absolutely in the picture, and there are absolutely aspects of reality that religion teaches us that we do need to include, and that secularists are absolutely missing, right? And that this kind of raw physicalist notion that unless I can measure it in a lab, it's not real, is going to make us miss the most important and the most consequential aspects of reality. So I look back and I see, I look at myself as Christian plus, right? Like I'm a Christian and a Buddhist. I'm a Buddhist and a Hindu, right? Like I each of these perspectives have helped inform my perspective. And I think the fact that, if nothing else, religion does teach us that we are part of a vast landscape and we can only see part of it, usually, and that there are beings that mean well and other beings that don't mean so well. I think, again, the binary evil good is not so helpful. But I would say even then, something I pointed out recently on a podcast was that within the broad reach of Christianity, one of my incarnations, one of my instantiations within this lifetime was I was Eastern Orthodox for a while. And what's really interesting is Eastern Orthodox, to my surprise, coming from evangelical circles, will actually pray for the conversion of Satan. So that speaks to what I was saying before, right? There's no truly lost soul, right? That even these demons and these, which are creations, right? The Bible teaches us that they're creations, right? And Lucifer was considered the greatest creation, right? And that, the bigger they are, the harder they fall, right? So like he, in his delusion of grandeur, right, kind of fell. But it makes total sense to me that if your view is that he's a creature who's fallen into ignorance and is acting in unkind ways to other beings in that ignorance, that you would pray for those people, but you'd also pray for this being so that it would have a turn of understanding and return back to that oneness again. So, in other words, Christianity and religion absolutely has a role to play. It's just that it's part of a more pluralistic understanding of the entire picture.
So do you buy into the argument that religions were created by these entities to somehow guide us to an eventual end or to control us in a way? Do you believe that argument at all, or is that not something you...
There's different ways to approach that. So on the one hand, it's important to remember that my view is that even you and I are much more than just human.
Mm-hmm.
That human is just one of the refractions of experience that we chose. And we're simultaneously right now, there are other aspects of Scott that are showing up in other realities that he's just not tuned into yet. And that there's this kind of oversoul that learns from all of those experiences. And so that's the first thing to remember. So in that sense, this is where it gets tricky. A friend of mine named Jeff Selver, who's an experiencer from Canada, he had this experience where he realized he was only much later in life that he realized he's actually been abducted many times since he was a teenager, basically. But he also recognized these beings. On the one hand, it's all the usual stuff. They're abducting him. They're taking sperm so they can create hybrid beings. And a lot of stuff that people go, that looks pretty lo-fi to me, right? That looks like a negative entity or treating us like cattle. But his experiences, those same beings also teach him deep spiritual truths and have like seeded in his mind that he should study different aspects of spirituality to deepen his understanding of who he is. And one time he encountered an alien being that he called the Elder, he had the sense that she was ancient and very, very wise, and she could read his mind and said, your path will align right. In other words, like you will choose the right path. So, part of the trick here, though, right, is that when these beings get to a really, really high level and they are moving closer to source, and as I say, you become reality wielders, they will actually instantiate entire civilizations of new life forms. Because in their view, this is a beautiful way that that same source essence can be birthed into a new experience, and that all aspects of source learn and grow because of that experience. But the key is that you might choose when it's time to decide what is Scott's next life going to look like, or one of them. You will decide, I'm going to become a human being. So on the one hand, you are choosing to come into a form that was seeded by something we might call alien, but you are not just that, though, right? This is the whole key, is that you are not just the physical body talking to me through the screen right now, right? And in fact, that's a really helpful way to remember, is that all I am actually seeing is pixels on a screen, right? I'm not actually seeing Scott. I'm seeing a re-representation of Scott. And I'm saying even if you were to touch your arm, that also is a re-representation of a deeper spiritual reality, right? So on the one hand, we are coming in and choosing to be human, and therefore subjecting ourselves to being part of this species that has been seeded by these other intelligences, right? So it's complex, and it's happening on many different levels at the same time. So this friend of mine, Jeff, he became to recognize that he absolutely has agency and free will, and he chose to come and be a human that would also be part of this hybridization campaign, but he's also something much more than that as well. The other thing I would say is that, speaking of religious history, it's really interesting once you understand the whole notion of hybrids, right? And the whole notion of pregnancies that seem to happen spontaneously, right? Because we think about Jesus and Mary, right? And so obviously people come from a ufological point of view, go, okay, so Jesus was a hybrid, right? Because this is what people literally experience even today. They end up on a craft. Women will suddenly find themselves, without having any physical contact, which is exactly what Mary said, right? They'll find themselves pregnant one day. And then often what usually happens is the baby is removed before it comes to full term, right? And this happens, I know many, many people have been part of this hybridization campaign going back to the 80s and 90s. So when you look at Jesus, they go, okay, so We have a human being that suddenly became pregnant, and we have she gives birth to something that seems to have a transcendent understanding well beyond the average human, right? So to many people, they go, that's a hybrid. And some people go, oh, does that reduce it to something physical? And I'm saying it's always both and, because physicality is just an appearance of spirituality. Ultimately, the wisdom that he embodied and that I think really was meant to help us as a species, yes, was partly part of this hybridization campaign and a multi-species kind of intervention. But ultimately, that all goes back to source and is spiritual at its root as well.
So the Bible and other religious texts would be shaped by these entities that have appeared to us over time, and it's kind of a recorded history of that, and we've kind of put it, and now are those religious texts referring to God's source, or are they referring to these alien gods that created us?
That's a great question. And this is where it gets tricky, because first thing I would say is that I don't think it's true that all religions were necessarily directly created by these beings. I think often what happens is human beings have encounters with beings that they are blown away by, they don't know how to make sense of, and they form concretized understandings of that experience and what it means about reality based on those experiences, right? So I think some of what we're seeing with religion is a legacy of people having encounters with the phenomenon in ancient history. And we built up belief structures around it, just like some believers today, like Stephen Greer, has a notion of reality based on his encounters, right? That's the first thing. And secondly, I would say that what's fascinating, when I was studying this in college, I would actually read the Old Testament in Hebrew. So you get to see it not just as a translated version in English, but you get to see the original language. And you also have the contextual understanding of how that would have been understood in a Jewish world at the time. And what you come away with is recognizing that the later Christian redactors, which basically means editors, when they were translating these texts into English, sometimes skewed what was actually in the original language to make it look more like one thing than it actually really looked like. So that involves even things like you take a term like Yahweh, which is a specific name for a certain god, and you put beside it this term Elohim, which first of all, it's very interesting because that's a plural term. It's more likely pointing to like a council of beings than it is one God. But we translate it into English as God, right? And so what happens is these different terms are used in Hebrew, and we keep using this one term God, right, over and over again in English, and it gives the impression that it's one being. But that's not actually what the text describes. The text describes different kinds of beings. And once you recognize that, you start seeing, and you can't unsee it once you do see it, that there is certain beings that do seem godlike, who seem to be acting pretty capriciously and not very kindly to humans, right? And the challenge is the later redactors would use one term, and sometimes they would even literally insert a term that wasn't there to make it even more seem like it's the one original God. And so then it looks like a God who's changing his mind. Like 1 second, Abraham, you got to sacrifice your son. Next second, it's like, no, it's okay, you don't have to, right? So we try to make sense of that based on the English translation. And I'm saying the Hebrew translation or the Hebrew scripture points to something different and seems to point to numerous interdimensional God-like entities being on the scene, and humans sometimes either in real time making the mistake of going, oh, this is something supernatural, it must be the one God again, when it might be different kinds of God-like beings. And then later on in Christian history, that's even edited away even more based on the way these things are translated.
I just talked to a guy the other day. He was like a demonologist, but he was like non-denominational, and he was just like, the Bible's a lot of lies. He said there's some truth in there, but it's been changed so many times over history and the translations that you can't really believe it. And I was like, I have no idea what that truth is because can't read Hebrew. I don't have access to that stuff. I just don't know. So I don't know. That's a topic I want to cover, but I don't know. It's frustrating because like, I don't know, who to believe really when they start going down that path.
Well, and I totally understand. And I think, you're being wise and discerning and not assuming that you would be able to know at this point. But there's some other really interesting clues in the text because, for instance, when it says, we, not I. We will make them in our image, right? So first of all, plural reference to the beings, right? Secondly, what does it mean to be made in the image of, right? And this might be pointing to the humanoid form, right? So sci-fi kind of people go, why would aliens look like humans, right? That doesn't make any sense. But instead, if we actually are following a prototype by some subsuming species that seeded us, then we might be echoing their form, right? Which is more transcendent and older, right? It might be a form that's been perfected over time. There are different channeling traditions that describe that exactly. So I do think you can both find threads pointing to like the one original source in the Bible, but you also get confused sometimes by the fact that there are other entities, right, that are on the scene that are more powerful and more interdimensional than humans, but they're not the ultimate oneness or source consciousness, right? The original mind. So this is why I think it demands we have a layered understanding of reality. And only when we have a layered understanding do we recognize there's the one original source, the original mind, and there's many layers in between. And that to some extent, depending on how much you've remembered what you ultimately are as source, you'll be acting on different levels of distortion, right? And beings that have really forgotten who they are and are really buying into like everything is just physical. And if I don't kill it, it's going to kill me. If you really believe that, you will act in that way. Just like your point about, the lions and the alligators, though, that doesn't make either one evil or good. They're just acting on based on what they know and what they understand. And so different levels of ignorance, I think, comes in here.
It's not debated at all, the we versus the I. Is that a debate with historians, or is that accepted by everybody that was the true?
I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone who thinks Elohim as a singular term. Yeah, that particular phrasing always points to a plural kind of term. And another thing I would say too that's interesting. You might have people who will wax philosophical, they'll find some technicality to explain why they think it's not. But I think then you as a listener have to really ask yourself, are they trying to fit a round peg into a square hole because they want to believe that? Or is that the best depiction? What is the best consensus view of that term? That's what I would suggest you should look to.
Would that link at all to the Trinity and the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit and trying to fit three persons and that kind of confusion? Would that link at all to there was multiple beings that we tried to fit into one?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that's what I'm pointing to. There are paradoxes even within Christian tradition that point to this, right? That well, how is God, three in one? What does that even mean, right? It's pointing to something more complex, right? And it's pointing to something more relational. Another thing I would point to is that, you can definitely see an evolution in time of our understanding of who Satan was, right? Or is. And originally in the Hebrew, it's more like he is a member of the Godhead or a member of this council of beings. And basically is tasked with testing the humans, not to oppress and oppress them and make them live in fire and brimstone forever, but actually just to basically help them learn spiritual lessons, right? So, and then over time, he became more and more painted as this adversary of God, and eventually basically depicted as the personification of evil. But that is absolutely a later Christian addition. When you read the earliest understandings of how that figure that we call Satan or Shaitan in the Hebrew was relating to the Godhead, it was very, very different. So that's one thing I think that any religious believer does have to reckon with at some point, is that when we see this shift in the way a being is depicted over time, that tells us a lot about how shifting human understandings were slowly changing the way it was represented in the text.
I recently heard, and I've heard this from other people, when the disclosure movement was happening and kind of ramping up, there were numerous people in the celebrity or kind of like the intellectual celebrities that were or said they were told something's coming, they're going to give you this and that. And I actually even heard it was Eric Weinstein was one of them, a couple other people, and I actually heard Bernardo Kastrup say this on a recent podcast he was on about the UFO thing, that he was let down by the information he received, and then he no longer, it was really strange. And I was like, this is weird. It seemed like they were all being contacted by people in high positions of power or places of authority that they would believe in, and suddenly like the rug was pulled out, and what the hell happened? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think with Bernardo, I found Bernardo has a bit of a peculiar take on the UFO phenomenon from my perspective, because on the one hand, he would echo a Jacques Vallée kind of perspective that these are the same beings as religious history, and they're just being depicted differently over time. But that also means that he has a hard time believing that we actually have craft and hangar and in hangars, and we have bodies in gurneys somewhere, right? So he sort of thinks these things are happening in an imaginal kind of realm. And I remember I asked him that directly in the conversation we had on my podcast, like, what do you do with this notion of recovered alien beings, right? This is not happening in some other realm or some imaginal space. We supposedly have them, right? And they're carbon-based real entities, right? And I know that he really struggles with that. And I think that what he may be referring to there is that he was told certain things by certain people in authority, because I know that people in some degree of authority did reach out to him, but maybe he later on found evidence that seemed to controvert that. I'm not sure.
Last thing, I just want to give me one word answers for this. The biggest misconception about disclosure in 2025 is what?
That it's a one and done. It's going to be a process. It's going to happen over many years, because we will have to expand our understanding of ourselves and of reality to make sense of what it means.
If you open the door without energetic and good hygiene, like we discussed, what's the first thing that can go wrong, or what would someone notice that they need to pull back?
That you might sense that you're being encouraged to do something. You might have a thought that's occurred to you that doesn't seem like a thought typical to you, because when this happens, because we have porous identities, basically, you can have a thought occur that might not be originating from you altogether.
If hybrids are real, which I know you believe they are, what's a telltale signature that people often miss? And I know you don't want to reveal people's identities, but what's something that would be obvious to the public that they don't look at or look for?
Well, in terms of physical appearance, they wouldn't necessarily give anything away. Really comes down to the way that they can understand things outside of the usual temporal kind of frame. They can know the future, for instance. They can tap into consciousness. I've had people who can know what I'm dreaming, right? And know what I'm doing, even if they're located on a different continent. So it's the capacities are augmented, not necessarily anything you see physically.
And last one, what would actually count as progress on disclosure in the next year for you?
That's a good question. I haven't been asked that question before. Well, ironically, I think it's highly unlikely to happen. But what I would consider progress would be people really took seriously this notion of, I'm going to check my own biases, and I'm going to stick to the phenomenology, which is to say, what is the actual nature of the experiences? What can we say is happening in people's experience? And let's not add the interpretive overlay, because that only confuses things. So that would be progress on from my point of view, but I'm not hugely confident that we will see that happen. In fact, I think things will get more complex over time, because that interpretive overlay will keep coming into the picture.
And lastly, for anybody who wants to know more about you, the things you offer, where can they go to check you out?
Yeah, appreciate that. My YouTube channel is YouTube/ExoAcademian, so they can find me there. My podcasts are Point of Convergence, Liminal Frames, and Event Horizon, and all three of those are dedicated podcasts that they can find on a podcast platform, Spotify or Apple or whatever. Liminal Frames, spelled PH for frames in lieu of phenomenon. So they can find me there. But all of those episodes from those three different podcasts are also on my one YouTube channel. And I also teach classes related to some of the stuff you talked about earlier. That's called the Essence of Being platform. And they can find all the information about that at essenceofbeing.info.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Darren. I really appreciate it. And you were very generous with your time. So I hope you had a stimulating conversation. I know you have to talk about this stuff a lot. So
No, I loved it. I love this, Scott. And I'm glad we went a long time, because you have to in order to get into all the relevant parts. So I thoroughly enjoyed it.
If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure you like and subscribe. It is a great way to show your support to the channel and helps us continue to grow and get amazing guests to bring to you. Go ahead, like it now, and subscribe.